make sure people are here. And I think that's good. Again, Richard Howorth from Square Books. Welcome, everybody. This is one of our Crossroads book discussion groups that we started shortly after the murder of George Floyd as a way of using books to discuss race matters and other matters as well. Today we've got an excellent program, I believe, with Marvin King is going to be our host, and our guest is Stuart Stevens. Marvin King is a Texas native who's been here at the University of Mississippi in Oxford since 2005. He holds joint appointments as professor in both the African American Studies and Political Science departments. He's written on racial polarization of the electorate, representation of the Black electorate, and the effect of race in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Dr. King teaches American politics, African American politics, and politics in the American South. Welcome, Marvin.
Thank you.
Yeah, Stuart Stevens, many of you know, is a native Mississippian, a well-known, highly regarded political strategist for the Republican Party, a prominent veteran figure of 5 presidential campaigns, who is also a writer, the author of 7 books, 3 travel books or travel memoirish books, A Night Train to Turkestan, Modern Adventures Along China's Ancient Silk Road, Malaria Dreams, An African Adventure, and Feeding Frenzy, Across Europe in Search of the Perfect Meal. That's a trip that I would have liked to have gone on with him on. He's the author of a book about the George W. Bush campaign called The Big Enchilada, a memoir, The Last Season, a father, a son, and a lifetime of college football. Some of you may know that his father, the late Phineas Stevens, was a lifelong Ole Miss football fan. He's written a novel, The Innocent Have Nothing to Fear, about a Republican Party in disarray. The formidable critic, Michiko Kakutani, calls Stevens, quote, a terrific raconteur, funny, observant, and highly entertaining. And the great British writer, Martin Amis, said that Stuart Stevens is, quote, a perfect companion, brave, funny, and ever watchful. Now Stuart Stevens has given us It Was All a Lie, How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump, where he observes that the US, quote, is a country of 320 million people and is, quote, growing less white every day, and that, quote, Donald Trump has served a useful purpose by exposing the deep flaws of a major American party. This is an interesting and important book. Stuart, thank you for doing it, and thank you both for being here with us today. Marvin, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Stuart, glad to get to talk with you about this book, and I'm really glad that we're getting to talk after the election, so we can discuss all the things that you talk about in your book. And if you haven't read the book, I encourage everyone to read it. I'm a lifelong political fan and a political scientist, but I learned a lot about some of the what happens on some of the campaigns and some of the inner the thinking that's going on when you're doing a campaign, and so you learn a lot from this book, and so I appreciate that you wrote it, and I'm glad here to be talking to you now. So as I was reading the book, your thesis is that over the last 20 years, the GOP has kind of deteriorated into a party without principles, that it decided it was easier to remove voters rather than change its policies to what a majority of voters actually want. And as a result, Trump is the product of this deterioration. And Trump could not have happened if the GOP had ideological principles that actually mattered, that it was actually going to stand behind. So for instance, deficits and debts soared under the Trump administration. And despite campaigning for years to overturn Obamacare, when the Republicans had the opportunity, they couldn't actually come up with anything because the party didn't actually have anything there. And so, you know, there's not an ideological lodestar guiding the Republican Party. So I just kind of want to start us off with that. You know, is that an accurate assessment of the book? And how does that help kind of explain how we get President Trump?
Yeah, well, first, it's fantastic to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'd rather be in Square Books than just about any place in the world. You know, my overall thesis is that really what's happened to the Republican Party is all about race. If you go back to in the post-World War II Republican Party, which is really my brief here, if you go back to 1956, it seems incredible, but Eisenhower got almost 40% of the black vote. So you go to 1964, Goldwater got 7%. So you could have made a case at the time, I probably would have made a case, I hadn't been like 8 years old, that after the Civil Rights Act passed, which Goldwater was against, that African Americans in some numbers would come back to the Republican Party. Shared values of faith, basic social conservatism, patriotism, entrepreneurship, some basic values, but it never happened. Trump ended up with maybe 8% of the African American vote. So, you know, by that theory, something like, you know, 30, 50 Republicans are being okay with African Americans. And that is really the original sin of the Republican Party. And by that, I mean that if any business knows that, you know, 90+% of its audience is going to be of a certain sort, of its market share, it's going to be of a certain sort, you're going to get good at selling to those people and not good at selling to other people. And it used to be in the party that we considered this a great failure. I mean, we talked a lot about the need to be a big tent party. You know, I worked for George Bush in 2000, and he had this vision of compassionate conservatism. And, you know, 2005, Ken Melman, who was chairman of the Republican Party, went before the NAACP and gave a speech and apologized for Nixon's Southern strategy, which intended to divide votes. But now we've sort of abandoned that. We don't even pretend that it is a failure. And I think what's happened is that the Republican Party has emerged as a white grievance party. And we've always had politics of hate in America. Father Coughlin, you know, we had a huge fascist movement in the 30s. But it's never been embraced by a major party. And I think that's the difference now with Trump. It's not that Trump, I think, necessarily made that many people more racist, but he has given people permission that it's okay to be racist. And I think that really to be a Trump supporter now, and, you know, I always get in fights. Well, I don't fight over this stuff, but it's always, you know, my old Republican friends go, okay, so look, Stuart, let me get this straight. 74 million people voted for Trump in this last election. That means there's 74 million racist. And well, first I always think, well, there probably are 74 million racists in America, so don't be so like shocked about that. But I think it means not that you have to be a racist to support Trump, but you have to be willing to admit that something is more important to you in a president than having a racist as president. And what that means. And I think that the ramifications of that really define the party. Define it in a policy sense, define it in this need to create an alternative reality now. You know, the Republican Party can only thrive in basically an overwhelmingly dominant white America. So when you talk about Make America Great Again, what you're really talking about is that world in which whites dominated American landscape in a way that they never will again. So, you know, you look at what's happening now with Trump saying that he won, and trying to talk about votes in Wayne County, Michigan, or Fulton County. What he's really saying is, I won white people. And that these other, when he talks about illegitimate votes, I want all the legal votes. And really, this is just a variation of Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. it's just extraordinary and incredibly depressing that the Republican Party is allowing this to happen.
So why do you think, so I have lots of questions there. So why did they go down this path? They didn't have to go down this path. Are you saying that the Southern strategy, and then followed by, in your book, you talk about Reagan's speech in 1980 at the Neshoba County Fair, where he's talking about states' rights. The Republican Party didn't have to go this path, and surely there were, because we know that there were moderate Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans back in the day, who said, no, this isn't who we are. We're not the Goldwater type. But the party chose to go down this path. So it seems that it was a purely political decision once upon a time, and now the effects of this are Trump. I tend to think of folks like Newt Gingrich coming on the scene in 1994, that really, you talk about the GOP as a grievance party. To me, I kind of trace it back to then, but it was layered over because you had Republicans like George Bush, who was a compassionate conservative. And I was in Texas at the time, and I know he got 40% of the Latino vote, right? So the Republican Party there were more moderates, and that seems to not be the case anymore.
No, I mean, it used to be, David Brooks just wrote an interesting column about this. It used to be when you're a Democrat and Republican, you could still ask the question, are you a conservative or liberal? Mm-hmm. And, now we don't ask that. Though I don't know what conservative means today in America. I mean, I worked for the Republican Party for decades. And if you held a gun to my head and said, what does it mean to be a conservative in America today? I'd say, shoot me, I have no idea. I mean, say what you will about Elizabeth Warren, she can articulate a theory of government that's cogent, that's coherent. You may hate it, you may love it, but she can argue with you and it makes sense. There is no conservative center-right party of any coherence. The only thing that the Republican Party exists now is to defeat Democrats, which is why I say it's really like a cartel. I mean, nobody asked OPEC what its greater moral purpose is. It's like, they say oil. Nobody says the narco cartels like, well, really, why do you exist? It's like, well, we exist to sell dope. The Republican Party exists to beat Democrats, which is a kind of moral vacuum that you've seen exploited by Trump. But I think that this fundamental question of why the Republican Party was unable to attract more African-American votes is really the essential question. And I think that probably it's because it was hard. It was difficult for Republicans to do this. And they had to make tough decisions that had something to do with self-awareness that they were unable to. And for years, in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, there was this theory in the Republican Party that the reason that we couldn't attract African Americans is that we didn't know how to talk to African Americans. It was a communications problem. That really African Americans had a natural bridge of social conservatism, patriotism, the church, the role of faith in the family, in the public square, that they were natural Republicans. We just didn't know how to talk to them. So it spawned this sort of fascinating subculture of African American Republican consultants who would come down to predominantly white campaigns with predominantly white candidates to teach us how to talk to Black people. And we would all sit there and listen. And I can remember, I'm sort of ashamed to say, like, well, this is really profound, So if we say we're talking about meaningful jobs and good jobs, that'll mean that all of a sudden they'll vote for us instead of just talking about jobs. And of course, it was all gibberish. It wasn't that African Americans didn't understand Republicans. It was that they did understand Republicans, and that the party was unable to appeal to make the choices and admit that what they were offering in a policy sense was not appealing to these people. And to me, it all goes back to this fundamental contradiction to this, speaking of Reagan, Ronald Reagan had this line that was sort of a joke and it was sort of a truism. The most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm here from the federal government to help. And we used to laugh at that and thought it was funny, thought it was true, blah, blah, blah. But how do you square that with trying to appeal to a group of people that the most positive force in their lives is often the federal government, that their best hope to lift themselves up out of whatever station they're in now, they're aspirationally, is the federal government. And there's no way to really square those two. And Republicans never made the tough policy decisions to this day that will appeal to African Americans. And that, to me, I think it is about policy.
Well, that's right. And so we know, and I teach this to my students, that Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, ending Jim Crow, everything was from the federal government imposing upon the states like some baseline standard. And now what we've seen since Shelby versus Holder, once the federal government didn't have that direct oversight, the pre-clearance over select states, many in the South, that as soon as that went away, what you then saw Republicans do was reduce access to voting, either through voter ID or the elimination of a lot of voting sites. And so in that sense, it's hard to say that the Republican Party is interested in squaring what you're saying here, that losing the Black vote is not really meaningful at all to the Republican Party. And then as a result, right, it can then engage in all sorts of policies knowing that Black voters aren't going to come their way. And so I look at all these voting restrictions, and you mentioned Wayne County, Fulton County, right? The states or the counties that Trump, the 8 counties in Wisconsin that Trump asked for a recount in, were all heavily Democratic, heavily minority counties, right? Not rural Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is why, I believe that the only way for the Republican Party to change is through defeat. That's why I say you have to burn it to the ground. I finished this book about a year ago, and it's a pretty bleak book about the Republican Party. But man, I look at it today and go, wow, I was way over optimistic. I never would have thought that what is happening now, that you have somebody lose a presidential race by over 7 million votes. Trump got under 47% of the electorate. I mean, Mitt Romney lost with 47.2%. Mm-hmm. And, 306 electoral votes. This is not a close election. And Republicans won't admit that Donald Trump won. I mean, I remember, when I was working in the Congo and I was with this guy who was a UN observer, he said, one of these guys that done these races in Afghanistan and all these places. And he goes, Stuart, the thing about this democracy thing is somebody's got to be willing to lose. And I always thought that was very profound. And that's sort of what's happening now is really a fundamental attack on democracy itself. And the root of it is that Black people's votes should count less, if count at all. And the Republican Party is just, no one is saying anything about, for the most part, Mitt Romney is. Well, but others aren't saying anything. And I don't think this is going to change until they can't win. I think it is only through fear and defeat. You win a war either through attrition or submission. And I think that the only way this will happen is through submission, that they're going to have to realize that they just can't win. And this is going to happen. You look at, here's an amazing stat to just roll around in your head. Americans who are 15 years old and younger, the majority are non-white. Now, odds are really good they're going to turn 18 and still be non-white. And what that means for the future of the Republican Party is a death blow, as the Republican Party is now. It'll have to change. And you can look at what happened to the Republican Party in California. I mean, the Republican Party in California used to be the beating heart of the Republican Party, the electoral citadel. Now the Republican Party's in 3rd place.
Sure. My students are always amazed when I remind them that Nixon and Reagan both came from California.
Heart of it.
Right. So it seems that, so then the question is, why, this seems blindingly obvious, yet what you're saying is the Republican Party isn't taking the steps there. And I think there's 2 reasons. One, Trump's Twitter feed scares the bejesus out of many Republicans. And so they don't want, Mitt Romney, as you said, is one of the few who are willing to stand up. You have senators like Ben Sasse who will say things privately, but not really publicly. And then to me, the conservative media establishment, right? So between Fox News and talk radio, it seems that they cow Republicans into enabling and carrying on this path that they're on. And so I hear what you're saying, where they have to lose, but it seems that the right-wing conservative media establishment is okay with losing as long as they're, you know, owning the libs. And is that right? Is that, you know,
well, I think eventually, you know, like most things in life, politics is ultimately about money in a lot of ways. And I think eventually, if Republicans lose enough, they won't be able to get the corporate backing that raise the amount of money, because ultimately, big donors and sort of, they're interested in winning. And they want to be for someone that's going to be able to affect them. I mean, it was fascinating, you know, after Biden won, you saw General Motors dropped its lawsuit fighting emission standard change. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, we want to be for, you know, as Haley Barbour, who I worked for in Mississippi, had this wonderful phrase. He said, you know, politicians should be for the future because it's going to happen anyway. And, you know, the Republican Party decided it's for the past. And it's a lot easier to predict how this ends than how long it takes to end. It's kind of like the big, you know, the subprime mortgage crisis. If you saw a movie like The Big Short or read about it, you know, it took longer to happen, but it happened because the fundamentals were there. So when you're only appealing to white votes, and the essence of Trump's appeal is non-college educated white votes, which are the fastest declining large demographic in America. So, I mean, here's another little mind-blowing stat. So Reagan wins in 80, sweeping landslide, what, 44 states, I guess, right? He got 55% of the white vote. John McCain lost with 55% of the white vote. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it wasn't close.
Right.
So, you know, after Romney lost, the party went through this self-analysis, so-called autopsy, to its credit, you know, and the conclusions were pretty obvious, you know, needed to expand to more non-white, younger voters, more women, particularly single women. And then, you know, this was presented not only as a political necessity, but a moral mandate that to earn the right to govern this big, cacophonous, changing, confusing country, we had to be more like the country. And then Trump came along, and it was almost with an audible sigh of relief. They just threw this aside and they'll thank God we can just win with white people. We don't have to go through pretending we care about this stuff. And I don't think it's gonna, you know, you look at 2024, man, who's running, there's no anti-Trump market in the Republican Party. I mean, I just worked in the Lincoln Project for a year, and our goal was to peel a certain percentage of mainly college educated whites off of Trump. And we were successful. But you don't see anybody emerging and saying, I'm going to run as the anti-Trump. And after Goldwater lost, you saw Republicans. You saw George Romney emerging like that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be a different Republican. And there was a market for that then. Now there's not. And I think it's just going to get worse and worse.
So it's interesting because I was surprised on election night that Democrats overall didn't do better. I felt that some of the Republicans, especially in the Senate, that Democrats had tied to Trump, that they were going to win more of them. So there was a surprise. There was enough voters who voted for Biden, but then still voted for Susan Collins and Joni Ernst. And
I have a theory about that.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear that.
My theory is that this race was about decency. And, you know, it really wasn't an issues race. It wasn't a race where they went out and said, okay, this is Medicare for All's on the ballot. What Biden said was the soul of the country's on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Decency. So you could look at someone like Susan Collins and say, okay, that's a decent person. I can vote for Susan Collins. She passes the decency test. You know, I can vote for Tillis in North Carolina. He passes. I mean, if that's the question, okay. So without a issue framework to drive an election, ultimately all elections are about what question is being answered. You know, famously in 92, Reagan, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Mm-hmm. When Clinton ran, you know, was the economy stupid? Mm-hmm. I think this race was about what Biden tried to make it about. Mm-hmm. And I think Biden was extraordinarily successful. I think the question is going to be, if you look at the success Democrats had in the midterms in 18, it was largely because it was issue driven. And I think that there is a winning framework of issues that Democrats can drive to. And if you look at Medicare for all is a lot more popular than a border wall. Now, Medicare for all, when you take away any private insurance, is not. So, you know, people say, how come there's not really three parties in America? To me, there really are, because there's two parties inside the Democratic Party. You know, it's kind of a Bernie Sanders party, call it, and say a Joe Biden party. And to me, the future of the big policy questions in America are going to be decided by that fight inside that party. Mm-hmm. You know, like take national health insurance, right? In 10 years, 15 years, are we really going to be the only Western country that doesn't have national health insurance? Mm-hmm. I can't imagine it. So what that's going to be is not going to be decided by the Republicans, because they had their chance. They'll just say no. It'll be decided by this debate inside the Democratic Party. And, you know, I don't know what that's going to be. But I think that is really what's going to decide. We're in for a period of center-left government in America, I
think. In my Southern politics class, we talk about how once upon a time you had, you know, your Southern conservative Democrats, and you had liberal Northern Democrats, and you had Republicans. And those conservative Southern Democrats were like the bridge between, and the liberal Democrats had to appeal to them, and the Northern and Republicans had to appeal to them. And they were kind of the bridge that would craft legislation that was in the middle. And we've seen the middle kind of hollowed out. And so it's interesting when you talk, but Biden, I think you're right, fits in there in that middle. And so as far as policy, if he can have that winning coalition of large enough Democrats, and it seems the squad gets a lot of attention, but I think there's a lot more Democrats who fit the Abigail Spanberger model, the moderate, slightly rural, urban, Virginia type of Democrat, who are really going to be where the party goes. So it'll just be interesting to see.
I think that there are a certain number of Democrats now who would have been Republicans 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. You know, Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, right? I mean, I worked for Tom Ridge, who was the last Republican governor to be reelected in Pennsylvania, you know, and he excoriated Trump, you know, and is one of the few Republicans now who is speaking out and calling Trump, you know, failure to accept democracy as that, you know, what it is. It's an attack on America. In a world in which Tom Ridge was a viable Republican, which he really wouldn't be now, a guy like Connor Lamb could be a Republican, and he could be a Tom Ridge Republican. But those don't exist anymore. I think one of the really telling things is, in a way, you know, there is this kind of other Republican party that we don't talk about much, and that's these Republican governors in these blue states that are really successful.
Yeah. Larry Hogan,
mm-hmm. in Maryland, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, Phil Scott in Vermont. Okay, I worked for all those guys. Mm-hmm. I love those guys. They are wildly popular. I mean, they're basically just good public servants. They can't choose their own Republican state party chairman. They're Trump people. And, you know, in politics, that's just such a mind-boggling concept. It's really like saying that Bill Belichick can't pick his own quarterback.
Right.
It's like, but that's just how it is now. They don't have a place in the party.
It's interesting you mentioned those Northeast Republicans, because the one other Republican you had mentioned by name who had stood up to Trump was Mitt Romney, a Republican governor of Massachusetts, of a liberal state, right? And so it kind of fits that model of someone who can work across the aisle. You know, and famously, George W. Bush, you know, that was one of his early claims to fame as why he was presidential material, was because he could work with a Democratic legislature in Texas.
And he did.
Yeah, and he did, right?
I think, you know, if you go back, and there's those of us who worked for Bush, there's a little parlor game that what Bush presidency would have been like without 9/11. And, you know, if you go back, what was his first major piece of legislation? It was No Child Left Behind. And if you look at the photo of that signing, you know, Ted Kennedy's over his right shoulder. And, you know, today that'd be presented like in a war crimes tribunal, you know, like, look at this traitor. But that's the way Bush governed, out of necessity and I think nature, working with Lieutenant Governor Bullock, who you remember, mm-hmm. Who's a Democrat in Texas. And
Well,
I think that was really the last best hope of the Republican Party in retrospect to carve a different path. Had Bush been able to successfully execute a different agenda domestically, I think we've been a very different party. I mean, one of the lessons I take away from this is, you know, everything we were talking about in high school civics, that leadership matters. Like, it's probably true. So, you know, with this huge fascist movement in America in the 30s, how come America didn't become fascist? Probably because Charles Lindbergh wasn't president, Roosevelt was.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, had Mitt Romney won, the Republican Party would be a very different party now.
Right.
But it'd be the same people to a large degree. So look at Germany in 1938. You know, leadership probably matters. And I think one of the roles of in a civil society of a political party is sort of a circuit breaker function. And the Republican Party never pulled the circuit breaker on Trump. And I think it enables Trump, right? So maybe you don't like Trump so much, but someone like Rob Portman, who I work for, I love, close friend of mine, breaks my heart. You go, well, Rob Portman's like a really decent, good guy, which he is. You know, I mean, if he's for Trump, Trump couldn't be that bad. Maybe stuff I don't like about him, but okay, so I'm for Trump. He gets approved. It's okay, it's acceptable. I mean, if a bank robber was elected president, probably bank robbing would become more socially acceptable. Like, okay, he's a bank robber, but you know, he could be president. And I think it's a great moral failure of the Republican Party.
Well, you know, something that we've learned in party politics that separates the Republicans and the Democrats is traditionally we would see the Democratic Party as more grassroots, bottom up, in the sense that Democratic activists seem to have no problem taking their leadership to task if they are advocating.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right.
Advocating for policies they don't want. Whereas the Republican Party, there is more of a tendency toward authoritarianism, meaning what the leader says goes. And so if the leader says that, if the leader tweets X, then we believe X. And so
I think the root of that is lack of diversity. That I think that one of the reasons that grassroots is, because that grassroots is diverse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that affects the party across the board in great policy sections. I mean, if you ask a Republican 35-year-old high school teacher what his views on taxes are, and a Republican 65-year-old hedge fund manager, they're probably pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, but they're both white, and they probably are against taxes. You know, you ask a 35-year-old African-American Democrat what his policies on taxes are, and a 65-year-old Democratic hedge fund, they're probably going to have different views on taxes.
Right.
And that's a strength.
That's right.
It's a problem governing, but that diversity, I think, is ultimately a creative tension that you need.
You're that with the creation of
authoritarian movements with people who look different in the groups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They all tend to look the same.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say, you see that with the creation of Biden's cabinet right now, the demand from the different constituent groups on who needs to be in that cabinet. And I don't recall that with Trump's cabinet. Again, to your point, there was the lack of diversity, right? It was just whomever. Richard.
I've got a few questions from a few folks, and I'm going to give you 3 questions, and you can take them in that order. The first came from Joanna Quinn, who is asking from both of you for a prediction in Georgia. Second question from Katie Morrison. How is the South in particular affected culturally and politically by the election and the Trump phenomenon? And number 3 from David Cruz. Where are the good Republicans who you supported, Stuart, like Rob Portman? Why don't they speak out? Those are your 3 questions so far.
Well, let me take the last one from my old friend David, who is a character in Night Train to Turkestan. That breaks my heart. I mean, I mean, it's almost even hard to talk about. I never would have believed that this would happen. And I mean, I know these people. I never would have imagined that they would go along with what they've gone along with. And, you know, I'll never wonder how 1938 happened again in Germany. I'll never wonder how, you know, the Sarajevo Olympic Stadium became a torture center. It's just cowardice. It's not complicated. It's not novel. It's not new. And it's not pretty. What breaks my heart is these people are the legacy of the greatest generation. I mean, courage isn't standing up to Donald Trump. Courage is getting out of the boat when the guy in front of you got shot. You know, that's what they did. I just, it's heartbreaking to me. It's really soul crushing. And I just, you know, I can never look at the world the same because of it. As to Georgia, I mean, it's really fascinating. You know, the reason these runoffs were invented, and Marvin knows a lot more about this than I do, well, was basically in part to stop African Americans from winning statewide office. You know, the idea being if one African American made it in the runoff, all the other white voters would coalesce and support the white guy. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I think Warnock has a better shot. In the Lincoln Project, we're doing everything we can to help both those candidates. I think Loeffler and Perdue represent everything that's corrupt about Washington. Polls just came out today that were shocking. It showed Perdue and Loeffler losing. What's happening now with this insane conspiracy of Georgia has got to be hurting Republicans. I mean, you know, Sidney Powell held this insane news conference yesterday, whatever you call it, public breakdown, saying that Republicans shouldn't vote in Georgia because, you know, the system's rigged and it doesn't matter and you're just going along with it. So, you know, probably you run those races 10 times, Republicans win 7. But, you know, they could win. Democrats could win. I hope they do. And what it means for the South, I think it's fascinating. I think you're going to see South Carolina become a purple state. Part of this is Hispanic votes. I mean, Biden in part won Georgia because of Hispanic votes. And it's just those changing demographics. So I think I supported Espy, having worked for Republican governors, senators, congressmen from Mississippi. I supported the Democrat. I think he would have been an extraordinarily more effective senator than Sidney Hyde-Smith, who's just kind of an invisible senator. But there'll come a day, I mean, when African American will win. I mean, you need to get a little bit more % of the white vote, and you'll do that. I think one of the fascinating things about Trump is he's really bet on the wrong cultural side. So you take, I mean, I talk about this a lot. You take Mississippi, we finally bring down the state flag, right? Very moving, powerful. And, you know, that same week, Trump gets in a fight with NASCAR because they've banned the Confederate flag. So you have Republicans on the wrong side of a cultural war with NASCAR? I mean, really? NASCAR? And he's on the wrong side of a war over masks with Walmart. It's like, really? Walmart? That like some, like, you know, international Zionist conspiracy? I just don't think there's a future in that. I mean, I think your average suburban white kid in Mississippi, they look to black rap stars as cultural models more than Robert E. Lee. They'd rather be a black rap star than Robert E. Lee. It's just betting on the wrong side. I think this whole appeal to suburban housewives was a wrong bet for Trump. First of all, I know a lot of women who live in the suburbs. I don't know any of them that consider themselves housewives. Most of them have like 8 jobs. And I don't know any that would like to think that their kids would want to see them as someone of a different ethnicity or religion moved in next door. They wouldn't welcome them. There's just nothing in our culture that supports racism except for these septic, you know, toxic pools on the internet. So I think that's all changing. I think it's just the wrong side that Trump is bet on. And I think had Republicans taken a stand against what Trump is doing now, it could have been the beginning of a rebuilding of the Republican Party in some sense. But this is just all about race, what Trump is saying in this absurd conspiracy theory. And Republicans are going along with it. And I think African Americans and other non-whites are going to see this. I think the impact of Kamala Harris being vice president is going to be so profound. I mean, I just think we really just can't imagine it. And I think the odds are that Kamala Harris is going to dominate American politics in the next decade. I mean, odds are, vice presidents tend to become presidents. And, will Biden run for a second term? Who knows? Maybe. But I mean, she very well could be president in 32. And I just think that's going to completely change our for the better, our politics.
Another question, Marvin, why don't you answer this one and then follow up on those ones we just did. But
sure.
Claiborne Barksdale asks, wants you to speculate on what does Trump do in 4 years?
Provided the Attorney General in New York doesn't have them wrapped up in lawsuits, then he'll probably run. This seems to be, from all objective analysis, to be a moneymaker for him. Thinking about the $170 million that they've raised to fight the lawsuit, and I think 75% of that, only 25% of that actually goes to legal bills. The rest is essentially a slush fund. So that's a good deal. So he'll probably run again, and in the next 4 years, over the next 4 years, scare other Republicans from saying anything against him, from creating a network of Larry Hogan type Republicans to challenge him. So I think he's going to run again in 4 years. As far as Georgia, I agree with Stuart that Womack is the best bet, and specifically of something that you said about the decency issue, that Loeffler is going to have a harder time on that decency test. The way she took to task her own WNBA team, mainly Black athletes, and getting on them for how they wanted to share in the protests of the George Floyd killing, that sort of thing is really going to, I think, alienate a lot of voters. So I could see her having the harder time of the two. In the South, I was just thinking of those examples. You're talking about the flag. One of the other things culturally on the wrong side, I believe, was renaming army bases after Confederate soldiers. It's like, what other country has army bases named after the people who tried to take down that country? I mean, that it's just unheard of. And so to be on that side, and another stat would be throughout the whole country, I believe this was true from the 2020, I haven't looked at it since all the election returns have been in, but certainly in 2016, overall Americans under 40, 45 are leaning Democratic. And so when I think of all the folks in America all the generations that comprise, that's not a battle that they're interested in fighting, keeping Confederate names on US Army bases. So for Trump to do that, to me, it harkens back to a name you mentioned in the book, Stuart, that if people don't know this name and they want to learn more about this specific topic, read about Lee Atwater. Because Lee Atwater to me is part of that when we talked about the Republican Party pivoting and kind of doubling down on race and saying we're going to go after white voters and we're not interested in Black voters anymore. I mean, to me, that's Lee Atwater, and you mentioned him in your book, and I just see that seems to be fighting a long-term losing battle.
Yeah, Lee was a tragic, I knew Lee well. A tragic figure. Died way too young and died a very unhappy person.
couple more, and then I'm gonna let y'all wind it up. Please explain the role of evangelicals as supporters of Trump. Is it all related to life issues or anything or something else? Do you see the Iowa caucuses as ever having an impact on selection of a presidential candidate in either party? One more quick one. Is the approach of Stacey Abrams in Georgia a key for Democrats in other southern states?
Well, look, first on evangelicals, we talk about evangelicals, but it's really white evangelicals. Non-white evangelicals hate Trump. So if we were taking an SAT test and we said, okay, white evangelicals hate one person, non-white evangelicals, or white evangelicals love one person, non-white hate that person, is the denominator evangelical or white or non-white? And I think we'd say white or non-white. So it was evangelicals that beat Roy Moore. It was black evangelicals. Asian American evangelicals can't stand Donald Trump. I just think that it's one of these misnomers. Be saying like, why are white Ole Miss fans for Trump? And the function is the whiteness, not being the Ole Miss fan. I think it's a complete misreading. Now, I also think there is this, phenomenon in the evangelical world of these kind of larger than life corrupt figures, the Schweikerts, the Bakers, that they even kind of look like Trump. They all have these kind of larger than life, painted artifice. There's something about them being different than you that makes you judge them differently by a different standard. So I think there's kind of a culturated acceptance of that. There's a wonderful book, I can't remember the title, by a Republican consultant named Ben Howe, who grew up in an white evangelical family. His family was involved with Liberty University. Who really, you could Google that title of that book, but Howe, H-O-W-E, he really wrote a beautiful book analyzing this. And he grew up in that world and really asked a lot of these same questions and can answer it more profoundly. Iowa, I don't know, man. If I never have to spend another Christmas in Iowa or New Year's Eve in Iowa, I'd be like a happy guy. I don't know. Iowa never mattered until Jimmy Carter won in Iowa, and then George Bush won in Iowa in '80, but still lost the presidency, but it put him on the map to win in Iowa. I think it could still come back. I think it could. I think it just depends on the dynamics of it. I actually think New Hampshire has been hurt more. There was a New Hampshire tradition that you couldn't win unless you really worked New Hampshire. The famous joke, like, I can't decide who to vote for president, I've only met him twice. Trump blew that up. And I think to the probably permanent damage of what it means in New Hampshire. Was there a third question? I can't remember.
No, that's good. That's good. That's good. I think we're good. Marvin, anything you want to follow up on?
Oh, I would just say that it seems it might behoove both parties to come up with a different nominating process that maybe focuses maybe on states that are more demographically representative of the country, or some sort of rotation system that might moderate the selection from either party. And as far as the evangelicals, there's been a lot in the last year or two during the Trump years of Black evangelical pastors moving away from the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, they've tried renaming themselves, but the Southern Baptist Convention, because they felt that it was becoming overtly political. And so they're like, no, we're not part of this Trumpian orbit. you know, this is supposed to be about the gospel. And so, but that was, again, it was white. It wasn't evangelical that was making them Trumpian. It was the white that was making them Trumpian supporters. You know, so you're seeing this schism that Trump has created throughout all facets of society. And so in religious institutions, it's no different. And so maybe with him gone, maybe there's a possibility for healing. But again, I think to Stuart's point, it depends on what type of leadership the Republican Party can generate in a post-Trump world.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you. If I had my way, I would try to get the University of Mississippi to hire Stuart Stevens to team teach a course with Marvin King on politics and race in the American South. That would be great. Just a great conversation. And Stuart, thank you so much for this book. It was all a lie. You can get, I believe, signed copies from Square Books, and it's a fascinating, interesting read. And appreciate you so much, Stuart, you joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
Surely. Okay. Good night, folks.
Thanks, Marvin.
Good night. Thank you.